So let me ask you something. What makes you you? Is it your name? Is it your last name? Is it the way you look? The language you speak or don't? And because today's episode is about something people don't really like to talk about out loud. We're talking about gatekeeping identity, like who gets to be Latina, who gets to belong, and who gets to say, wait, I don't speak the language, but. And today I'm not doing this alone. I'm here with my friend Michelle, who I met in New Orleans. She's a teacher, now an academic funder, and she grew up in a town predominantly white. No Spanish at home, no bilingual household, but still very much connected to culture. So, Michelle, welcome to Fluent AF.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for having me on, Priscilla. I know your vibes are immaculate and I have so much fun talking to you, and I feel like we have a lot to chat about today.
Yes, well, thank you for that. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this. So, let's start simple, right? When people ask you where you're from, what do you say?
Yeah, usually I'm like, well, how much time do you have? Because, baby, it is a story. So typically the short and sweet answer is like multilingual. Especially living in New Orleans, I think we have like a better sense of what it means to have generations of being mixed race, of being multi-ethnic. My mom is white. Her family's been in America since like the 1600s. We're talking Salem witch trials. And then my dad's family is from all over the Caribbean. So his mom is from Ponce in Puerto Rico. And then his dad's family's from both Suriname and Jamaica. So a lot of like Caribbean, diaspora. There's just some really interesting mixes in there. And we're lucky to have a lot of like family history, old pictures. And so I think sometimes when we come from diaspora, we don't have access to that family history. And I feel really lucky to understand that. And that our family talks about where we come from and, why we look like a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that's kind of like, have people ever question you like, oh, you look a certain way, but do you speak
Hmm.
that or whatever? Have you ever encountered that?
Yeah, I think usually, depending on what I'm wearing, if I got the slick back bun, some hoops on, people can, pretty easily clock like, are you Puerto Rican or are you Hispanic? Are you Latina? And so I do think what comes up for me is that I don't speak Spanish. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. My grandparents spoke Spanish, and I learned a little bit in school, but not having the language definitely feels awkward at times, and I don't always want to admit it. And sometimes it's like, okay, I want to talk to my friends more or like talk to people out in the world. And I feel a little bit shy about the rudimentary Spanish that I do have.
Yeah, so do you feel like language can sometimes act like a gatekeeper?
Absolutely. And just like the cultural pieces behind it too. And a Puerto Rican Spanish is no joke. So there's like this added element of, okay, like I listen to a lot of the music, right? Or like, I definitely have heard family members speaking Spanish growing up, but there's so much that I don't catch. And so I feel like I'm kind of sometimes like on the outskirts of the playground watching the other kids play, but like I can't really join in without without having that same language.
Absolutely, yeah. And like people can make you feel like you don't belong, right? Because I mean, let's be real. People equate fluency with authenticity and it's not always the same thing. Like they equate this like, okay, you're fluent, you're authentic, you belong. But again, in your case, that's not real, right? And again, you grew up in a predominantly white suburban town, right? Where did you grow up?
Yes, in Connecticut. And both of my parents, also grew up kind of in these spaces where maybe there were good public schools, and especially for my dad, he was born in Queens, but then his parents moved him out to Long Island, and so he also grew up in this predominantly white town, and he was the only Black person there, the only Hispanic kid in his school besides his sisters. So I think for my parents and for my dad in particular, accessing whiteness, like for so many of our parents, was a way to have social mobility. And at the time, his mom didn't teach him Spanish because they, didn't want their kids to stick out or be different. And so I think it's interesting because I think on the some hand that on one hand, that served my dad well because he was able to be more successful in life. And then on the other hand, now that he's older, now that he's retired, you can see how he's kind of like curious about how that shaped his identity and his sense of self and how that passed on to us. So I think for me growing up, I feel like I was missing something, and then moving to New York and living there for a long time, moving to New Orleans, certainly, I feel a lot more affirmed in my identity being mixed race, and definitely living in New York felt a lot more affirmed in my Caribbean identity, had more access to culture, music, food, language, in a way that I just didn't have growing up, and sometimes it feels weird to be a full-on adult and be like, I'm still pursuing part of my identity. But then on the flip side, it also feels like it's never too late to build that up for yourself and build up your understanding of culture, especially when dominant culture and narrative in America tried so hard to make sure that people did not have access to language and did not have access to culture, and that, forced people to assimilate. So it feels like trying to do a reversal on that.
Yeah, it really shaped how you understood race, right? And growing up in your identity. It kind of like feels like you were navigating two different worlds, right?
Yes, exactly. Especially like with cultural foods and, growing up eating certain things at family parties and, you know, and then like going to school and kids were not eating those same things, or growing up, my grandparents and my dad's mom always had these huge parties at her house, like till 3, 4 in the morning, and they're listening to Spanish music and they're dancing with their friends. And so they, always had this kind of like fun side on the extended family, but I know that the kids that I was going to school with did not have that kind of experience in their families. Um, and so I found that to be interesting too, because I think also I had my white parent, my mom, was somebody who was extremely affirming in that, and was somebody who worked really hard to make sure, we're eating Jamaican beef patties, we're eating rice and peas and empanadas. Like she really worked hard to make sure that some of my dad's culture was present for us, even if that wasn't her culture. But she worked with like my grandparents to make sure that she could bring that for us. So I love that.
That's amazing. I love that, right? Go Vicky, right? I think that's pretty cool that
Go,
she
Vicky.
really focused on that, right? Now, on this show, I talk a lot about code switching and being from Miami and learning all the Hispanic lingo, all the cultures, right? Because it's a thing, right? We're not going to go to a Cuban bakery speaking Colombian Spanish. It's just a no-no, right? So did you ever code switch? Like maybe not linguistically, but like behavior wise?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it just depends on your friends and who you're around. And I feel like, especially being a teacher too, if you're talking to certain parents or to certain students, I think it can just be a way to affirm other people as well, especially in this time when we have kids and families who are being disappeared all over our country. We want to make sure that we are like checking in, building relationships. And I think a big part of that is code switching too. And yeah, I feel like also that comes with kind of like a invitation from other people as well, especially being somebody who's mixed and, maybe doesn't have the language. It makes me feel so thrilled when I get invited in a sense, in a space that's like, maybe some of my more Hispanic friends or my friends who are speaking Spanish. I feel like if I'm invited into that space, or like they send me a meme in Spanish, even on Instagram, I'm like, okay, I feel like, I'm included. I'm like growing my vocabulary a little bit. Um, so sorry, the dog just
No, it's
barked.
fine. She's excited too.
She's very excited.
Yeah, I agree. Like when we talked before, and before I started working on this script, you mentioned something that really stuck with me. And you said about your dad being mistaken for things like the gardener and him joking about it, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, my mom is this tiny white lady from Boston. She's blonde. She's got blue eyes. My dad's darker skin. And so growing up, yeah, people would sometimes mistake him for the gardener if they're at the garden center together, or people would definitely other him in our town. I don't think I was as aware of it growing up, but
Mm.
he now today will make a lot of jokes about it. And I do really think that is, him just trying to make sense of things and deflect. But it is really interesting that like for corporate America and for white America, which is our dominant culture, they see somebody who's Black or brown, they see somebody who maybe has a last name that sounds different from theirs, and they assume that that person cannot be, have a certain social mobility, that person can't work a certain job, drive a certain car, those types of things. And something I noticed too is like my dad, I always joke, I never see him in anything less than a polo shirt and khakis. That man comes downstairs dressed every single day. And I do think there's something about the way we show up in the world where we are like saying, I'm enough. I am, in this certain social sphere, even a certain economic sphere. And it's just really interesting too, because I think that's something that we're unlearning in our generation, right? Like this idea of presentable, this idea of professionalism at work, right? And being able to be culturally affirming. Like I think you and I were talking about this, that in the last couple of years, it's become acceptable to wear like big hoops at work. Right. Or like maybe a brighter lipstick. And so these things like
Sure.
big gold jewelry, even nameplate jewelry, right? Things that are now being co-opted by our white peers that are now considered acceptable in professional spaces. Like very recently were not. So it's so interesting to see like the ways that our parents and maybe us when we were younger were not able to access who, our cultural presentations. And now, those things are considered cool.
I agree. I agree. I feel like a lot of exposure, especially culturally speaking, subculturally speaking, does play a huge role in professional settings now. And it goes back to race, and we realize that race isn't just identity; it's perception. And when did you realize that?
It's so true. And I think it has to do too with even within families, colorism too, perception of identity. My older sister's a lot darker than me. Her hair's darker, her hair's curlier. And when I was born, I was a lot lighter. I had like blondish hair. So I think growing up, that certainly impacted our own identities and understandings of who we were. Because, if I straightened my hair, I think I thought to myself that I looked whiter, right? Or I looked a certain way. And so it's definitely interesting, especially living in New Orleans, a place where people can clock it immediately, right? Like you're
Hmm.
not completely white. There's something else going on in there, right? There's like a little mix. And so I think definitely growing up, I think there was almost like a pretending of, oh, we're maybe all the same. And although I think that there were some things there about my parents that they tried to like shield us from, but certainly growing up in an all white town, we knew we were different, or people would make fun of my last name or something. And so I think now in the world, and maybe it's, just being older, growing more into my features, or, maybe I catch a little tan in the summer, but I think that I feel a lot more comfortable in my own skin presenting as I am. Whereas, when I
Hmm.
was younger, it was like, I'm straightening my hair as much as I can. I'm over plucking my eyebrows, right? None of this like thick, beautiful eyebrows that, try to have now, it was like be
And that
as
everybody
white as
wants.
possible. That everybody wants. Yes. It was like, let me dye my hair, let me wear certain clothes and
Right.
be as white as possible.
Yeah,
And
same.
I've thought a lot about like when I wear my hair naturally curly, like what am I doing for little kids who see that and their hair looks like that? Or, what am I doing for other generations so that they know that like your hair is not unmanageable, right? You are completely acceptable and beautiful just as you
Hmm.
are. But damn, that's taken like over 30 years to have that sink in.
And embrace it. Yeah, because that's the thing, we don't just have an identity. People project one onto us.
Mhm.
right? And we talk about Latinidad and being Hispanic and being mixed. And, do you think that Latinidad has a spectrum? I think about this all the time and I'm like, well, you're a white Tina. I get that a lot. Or you are this, or you're that. Oh, but
Mm.
you're Hispanic, you're Iberian. So it's different, right?
Mm.
But I'm like, so where's the nuance? Where do I fit in all that? So do you ever feel like you're not enough for one side or too much for another side? Because I've always felt that way.
Yes, completely. I feel like it's always been like a deficit mindset, like not Puerto Rican enough, not black enough, right? Not white enough, not all of these, not enough of anything.
Uh,
And I also do think that Latinidad is like this concept of an extension of othering from the United States, right? And so
Agreed.
people are like, okay, so you're not what we expect, right? You're not like white, Irish, whatever. So we're putting you in another category. And something that I think about too is like we have different concepts of that's what that spectrum means versus other people who are not Latino. So
Yeah,
non-Latinos might be
it's
like,
true.
"Oh, that person's race is Mexican." Not thinking about if you look at people who are from Mexico, listen, it's the full spectrum racially, ethnically, right? And so I think that there's this misconception number 1 that like the countries that people are from or the regions that people are from are indicators of their race or ethnicity, and we just don't have that nuance in the US. I think in the Caribbean, especially, we have there's so much more nuance about racial identities and ethnic identities, mostly for the purposes of doing racism on people. But there is more of a nuance of the different ways that people are mixed. But yeah, I think it's a lot of it is from a deficit space of how white are you, how close to whiteness are you, right? And I definitely have felt, in my life like, okay, I'm not white enough, and then on the flip side of that, I'm not Hispanic enough, right? I'm not Puerto Rican enough. And definitely with our family from Suriname and Jamaica, like I don't have enough proximity to that, right? Especially like I have cousins that are much darker than me, right? Or are blacker than me. And so I think that's interesting. Whereas I have cousins that are whiter than me on the flip side. And so when you sit kind of squarely in the middle, I think it can feel like, who are you? Right. And then I
Mhm.
think we talked about this too, that the intersection with queerness as well, which is another like non-dominant identity, you could feel like, okay, I'm just in a gray area in my entire life. And I think that can be really lonely, and you feel like people might not understand or know how to put you in a certain box, right, to
Right.
understand you.
We hate boxes here. We don't need to fit in any. And we've come to realize that with age and appreciating heritage and lineage, right? I think that's such an important thing. You're talking about your family and your cousins. And last time we had a discussion about grandma, right? I think it was your great grandma and your grandma both. And that also stuck with me, the way that you were talking about how she was perceived and how she navigated being an immigrant. And tell me a little bit about her.
Yes. So when my great grandma Nana Lydia, she came to New York from Puerto Rico, and she left my grandmother Anita in Puerto Rico. And so Lydia came to New York. She worked in a clothing factory. I think she was sewing men's coats and dresses. And then she sent for my Nana Anita when she was 11, and she moved to New York. And my Nana tells a story of moving in with her mom again and realizing that even though her mom worked in this clothing factory, she only had 3 dresses in her closet because she had been sending them all the money back in Puerto Rico to be able to save up to bring them to New York, and to support them from afar. And so she just talked about like that kind of sacrifice and being scrappy and what it took. But Nana Lydia was somebody who was very, very small, much more like Taina, like darker skin, very indigenous looking. And she was extremely like today, maybe we would say she had kind of like a anger problem, but extremely fiery woman. She never married anybody. She never settled down with a man. She, one time there's this family lore always of her like getting in fights and stuff and like beating up men. And one time she was like going into a dry cleaner. They called her some kind of slur. And she goes outside the store, she grabs a brick, and she throws the brick through the window of the store just to, like, let these people know, like, "Hey, I don't mess with that, like, you cannot be calling me stuff like that." And so, I think in our family, like, we always kinda made fun of her, like, "Oh, she's so crazy, she's doing stuff like that," but this woman was doing that, in New York City in, like, the 40s, the 50s, and so way ahead
Wow.
of her time, and, like, somebody who did not have a lot of power, did not have a lot of money, right? But was kind of making her own way in the world. And even until when she was older, she always was like carrying a knife around in her purse. Like we were like,
In
Nana,
a
please do not
way. In a
do not
little
get in a fight
way.
today. Yes. So I think it's funny because we're like, today we're like, okay, girl boss, like
Yeah,
today we're
yeah,
like, this is
precisely.
aspirational. And at that time people were like, this woman is crazy.
Absolutely. It's an interesting how culture does get passed down, and they say that our strength comes from our paternal grandmothers, right? The wounds that carried our fathers. And it makes perfect sense, right? Because,
Wow.
we think about again culture and what was passed down, and what parts of your culture were passed down without language?
Mm. I think the resilience piece is something I think about a lot. I think, my parents gave me so many comforts in this world. I got to go to college. I, had a great job teaching. Now I have a great job working in the funder space, and and still sometimes things are tough in life, right? Like mental illness or just the whole world just being a dumpster fire. And I really think about my ancestors who worked so hard in some ways to even get here to America to begin with. I think about the work situations that they went through, whether it was literally working on a farm or working in a field or working in a factory. My grandfather, my dad's dad, he worked underground in the subway fixing the electrical signals.
Wow.
And so sometimes when think about like, can I keep going with something or, can I persevere? I think about what they sacrificed and that wasn't an option for them to stop, right? They just had to keep going. So I just feel like such a culmination of all of their hard work that I get to live, relatively freely compared to what their
Mm,
lives were. And I just think about all the steps that it took for me to get here, right? Like there are just so many people that have in history come together and in many ways like suffered and gone through it. And so I just feel a lot of gratitude. And I feel
mhm.
like that's a piece of culture in itself. Me and my girlfriend
Yeah.
always joke when our friends ask us to go camping, we're like, our ancestors slept on the ground and we are not gonna we're not gonna do it, girl. So I think about that as like a cultural heritage, like working hard, persevering, and like knowing that you're here for a purpose because others sacrifice so much to get you here.
Yeah, precisely. I think that's the thing about culture that people forget, that it isn't just words, it's vibes, it's history, it's resilience, it's food, it's energy, it's how you love, how your people loved, how your people view the world, and we inherit that, right?
Mm, yes. Yeah, we
Yeah, I
know that
agree.
through like epigenetics now, right? We know it's in our DNA. The ways that they survived, right? The way that they interacted with each other. That is completely, yeah, within us.
You talk about working in education, which is another reason why I wanted to have you on the show, because you've been doing this for years, right? And, teaching and now funding. Now, how has your identity shaped the way you see the system.
Absolutely. I mean, when I first started teaching, I just got out of college, my undergrad degree, and I actually was working in a biology lab. And at the same time, I was like nannying and some things on the side. And I thought, I might actually enjoy teaching. And I found this program through NYU where I went to undergrad that they were trying to get more teachers of color in the classroom in public schools in New York. So I applied to that program, and it was like a joint grad school, but you're working full time as a teacher. And in that program, I had multiple coaches who were women, one of them a woman of color. And I think that they were so instrumental in shaping my understanding of who I was as a leader. And just the fact that at the outset of my teaching career, I was in a program that was trying to get more teachers in the classroom that looked like the kids in the classroom, I think was
Mm.
really instrumental to me and like my understanding of why I was there. Um, and so I just think from the very beginning as a teacher, I knew that that was really important, that I was a role model for my kids. I think, public schools in our country have really been through it where there was a time where there was just kind of an influx of young white teachers going into school systems where, maybe they didn't look like the kids they were teaching and I think had best intentions, but maybe there was some harm done. And so in recent years, there's really been this push to get more teachers in the classroom who look like their kids and who have live in the same neighborhood as their kids and have similar life experiences, right? And can build these relationships with kids and families that just are deeper. And so that was always really important to me. And so I taught in New York, um, in a public school for 2 years. And then I moved to New Orleans, and I also taught at a public school here in New Orleans for a year. And I think that was one of the things that struck me moving here. I was new to the city, and New Orleans is so culturally specific, and it is an incredible place to be. And also I felt like as a person new to the city, sometimes I lacked the cultural understanding
Mm.
of
Yes.
where my kids were coming from. And so I think on the one hand, I really enjoyed being, maybe their only Hispanic teacher and forming that relationship with those kids. And now we know we have even more of a growing population of Hispanic students. But on the flip side, I knew that a huge part of teaching is being culturally responsive and understanding where your kids were coming from. And to be honest, I knew I had a lot to learn about the specific context of New Orleans public education. And also at the time, to be transparent, I think in New York, you could make a certain amount of money. The benefits were a little bit better to be a teacher longer term. And when I moved here, as a city, we really struggled to compensate teachers appropriately. And so it just didn't feel like it could continue in a career the way that it had felt for me in New York. So I ended up leaving and working in an education nonprofit here for a while. And then now I work for a funder. But I think just what it underscored for me is teaching. We're not in it for the money, right? It's tough work, but the connections with the students are everything. And students deserve teachers who look like them, sound like them, come from their communities, and who can affirm them culturally. They really need that.
Okay, yeah, I agree 100%. Like, I think that's so important as educators. And since we do create spaces, we do have that responsibility to connect and integrate, at least, right? What we know and learn our students' culture as well. So now, we talk about that and we talk about visibility and creating spaces. So let's get a little controversial for a minute. Can you fully belong to a culture you don't linguistically access? Or
Mm.
does language always sit at the center in general?
I do think that language does sit at the center of a culture. I think you can maybe visit with that culture and have parts of it, but I do think that language is so essential, and maybe it's not fluency, but I think understanding some pieces of language, right? Maybe some idioms, or maybe having enough of the language to grasp something. But I do think that, and especially in my own educational journey as an adult trying to learn more Spanish, I noticed that the more I learn, the closer I do feel to accessing my culture. And I hate to say that because I wish it was, no, I can access the culture without any language, and I'm enough, right? And I do believe I have, I treasure my family experiences and my cultural experiences, but I think I'd be lying if I said that the language is not essential, and that has been a major barrier for me, but I'm not like resigned. I'm not
Resigned.
resigned
I'm
to
not.
that. And I'm really grateful that it's so accessible now to learn Spanish. And we have so many wonderful friends to practice with and who are so patient with me when I'm stumbling over grammar and vocab. So yeah, I do think there's so much that you can't access without the language.
Yeah. And I love that, that you mentioned your family, and, we talked about the experience and what was passed down. And, what's something from your family that makes you go, ah, that's mine? Or, yeah, like a food, joke, a vibe, something that you're like, yeah, I belong.
Yeah, definitely the food piece. I think when I feel homesick, I'm like, let me make some rice and peas. Let me make some pernil, right? And that for me is such a close connection to my Nana, Aneta in particular. She was such a good cook. And although she likes to say that she doesn't cook anymore because she cooked her whole career and she's like, I'm done with that. But that definitely makes me feel the most connected to my culture. And I also too just think it's like the family dynamics too, where it's like I was talking to my coworker about this the other day. She's from Puerto Rico. Like, I feel like we're so nosy, right? We're in each other's business, and it's not even nosy. It's like, no, I know everything about you, right? And I'm like, I know what medications you're on, right? I know your ailments and your illnesses. And I think like there's just like this presumed familiarity sometimes that people don't get outside of our culture, right? And so I think that that's something that's like, oh, that's such a gift. Sometimes it's like being a part of a secret club
Mm-hmm.
where
Absolutely.
you're like, you get to access this warmth, this dynamic of like, come on in, like we are, we're this kind of like family, right? We'll feed you, right? We'll give you alcohol. We've got
Aggressively too.
music, aggressively feeding you. Yes. And the dynamic of, oh, you're not eating enough you're looking a little fat, right? So it's like
Mm-hmm.
all of these things. But yeah, I think the togetherness and the familial aspect of it is a cultural piece that's like we have access to that I will say white Americans definitely do not.
Yeah,
Non-Hispanic people
sure. I
definitely do not
agree.
have that. Yeah.
So on this pod, I usually do thought experiments, which is pretty much homework, but such a dreadful word. So I usually just give my listeners a little insight for the week, a little thought experiment, something to ponder on, something to practice or not, right? And, I want to do this one with you, but I also would like for you to answer it. So you're kind of doing the homework before everybody else.
Okay.
So I'm gonna, leave you with this. Imagine if someone tells you you're not enough, or something you've always felt in your body, right? Like maybe not Latina enough, not white enough, not black enough, not this enough, right? Or not that. Do you shrink, or do you redefine what that identity means? Because again, identity is not something you earn, it's something you live.
I think I think in this phase of my life, I'm not. called to shrink anymore, right? I'm called to live in multiple arenas, right? And
Not
I
no joke.
think of myself as like a chameleon, right? In my head, I call it like chameleon mode, where it's not so much
Yeah.
camouflaging, but it's like we can fit in. As people are
Yes.
multiracial, as people who belong to many cultures, we can fit in so many spaces, but in ways that other people could never dream, right? Of accessing that. And it's such a gift to be able to access so many spaces. And so I try to rest on that and know that, okay, I might not have grown up with the language, but I do still have access to culture. And as a language learner, right, that have every right to pursue that and grow that access. But I feel like now even more so it's a strength to live in many different places, and in a world where people are ever increasingly multiracial, this is just how it's going to be. And I think, as when one day if I ever had a child who would be multiracial as well, I'm going to have to explain to that little human, hey, this is how we think about ourselves in this world. And I would hope that by me embracing the way I live in different spaces with confidence, that other people are able to access that too, because we don't deserve to be filled with self-doubt. We should be looking at it from an asset mindset that it's a superpower.
Yes. And that's Fluent AF. So thank you so much for joining us, Michelle, for giving us a little bit of your insight, your experience. And if this episode hit, send it to someone who's been questioning about who they are, and you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with your people, and say Daria like you mean it.